All right, and hello again. Welcome to the second piece of journalistic writing basics, which is writing feature stories. Our last couple of videos covered news writing. This is going to be about the second, probably most frequent type of story we write, and that is a feature story. Feature stories differ from news stories in the sense that they're bigger stories typically, and they are human interest stories that appeal to an audience's emotions. These are not so much about informing an audience of news as much as they are connecting to the audience through a story that has some sort of common interest with the reader. As it says there, that this is supposed to be a story that a reader can easily connect or identify with. While it is to inform and to entertain, um, it is not necessarily much like a news story that does contain bias, just like we've talked about for any journalistic writing. It is not there to express the opinion of the writer, but to tell a story from a broad and all encompassing scope, which would go much more in depth than a news story could. Feature stories, unlike news stories, are not so time sensitive. While some stories need to be told in a little bit more timely fashion than others, we don't have to be as hard pressed to get the news story out before it changes. These usually are stories that hold their importance or their significance for longer periods of time. That comes mostly from the fact that they aren't totally event based. While, as it says there in the third bullet, that features may be linked to a current event. Perhaps it's something to do with about a war story, or maybe it's for our intents and purposes more, maybe it's about something that did happen at school, or a policy that changed. And while it can be connected to that event, which is possibly a news story, we aren't looking for the news. We're looking for the interest of the people that perhaps event involved. So I might not write about the day or the policy that when the dress code changes, for instance. I might instead write a story about a number of students who are affected by that dress code policy. And if I do that, I'm not really tied in making sure that I get it done this week or today. I might have a little bit more time so that I can go more in depth and find out the real story about who they are and how this particular thing affected them. Feature stories get to be a little bit more wide spread or wide reaching in their scope, in the sense that, as it says in that fourth bullet there, that they're not just a breaking news story. They can involve several aspects of the news story. It can be the people. It can have topics of food, pets, people, etc. Sometimes I've read recently a really good feature story on libraries, and it just covered different aspects of libraries around the world. And so many of those stories involved people, but the core of that story was about libraries, and so that's a little bit more. There's a little bit more freedom than in a hard news story. You may use facts in a feature story the way you use facts in a news story, but in a feature story, again, the focus is shifted from the events to the people. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, although I highly recommend coming back to this video, pausing on these screens, and looking at the different explanations of these. We went through in the last couple of videos the different types of news leads there are. And remember, in a news story, in the lead is we're trying to get as many of those 5 W's and the H in the first sentence as we can. And we certainly, whatever we don't get in that first sentence, we want to get done in the first couple of paragraphs. In a feature story, it's a little bit different. This is a little bit closer to what we kind of expect when we talk about writing maybe like an essay in an English class. We have several different types of leads, and again, I'm not going to read through all of the explanations for each one, but just there's some kind of funny names for these. A big potato lead is a type of lead where you kind of give a catchy statement that happens sort of in the middle of the story, and then maybe you go back and fill in details. Like the example there is like, and then suddenly everything stops. Well, now I need to know why. I mean, that catches my interest. I want to know why. Sometimes we have a descriptive snapshot. We paint a picture of a situation or of a person, like that example is there of Abraham Lincoln. And that way, that description of that person draws my interest and makes me want to continue reading. The striking statement, something that's got a little bit of a twist in it. Shakespeare left his second best bed to his wife. I mean, that's kind of, whoa, who was this wife? What was the bed? It creates interest. Misleading leads, where we kind of have some misdirection. I'd like to be peaceful in my sleep with like my grandfather, not terrified and screaming like the other people in the car he was driving. That's more kind of a joke than it is an actual feature lead, but you can see that we think we're going to read a story about, dying peacefully, and then it's actually about this crazy grandfather. And then lastly, a narrative, which all of these kind of are, but maybe we use a first person, or we tell a small story that introduces something that is going to change and then become our feature story. So as you see that there are many connections in features to news stories, which we kind of covered already, but the feature story is really the bread and butter of the journalist who wants to really go in depth and tell interesting stories about people and their emotions and feelings.